I let the director cancel my vacation. Then he cost us 100,000 euros per day. I never thought I would be betrayed by someone I trusted, especially not in front of the entire executive team. But there I was, sitting in that glass-walled conference room, watching Director Marcus cancel my vacation with a casual wave of his hand, as if my 3 months of planning meant nothing. "Emma's trip to Barcelona will have to wait," he announced, not even looking at me. "We need her here for the Morrison account." I'm sure she understands. The Morrison account. The one I'd already handed off completely to Sarah, with detailed transition notes and client briefings. The one that didn't actually need me at all. But Marcus didn't mention that part. He just smiled that practice smile of his while 12 pairs of eyes turned to look at me, waiting for my response. I felt my face flush hot, that familiar burning sensation that starts behind your ears and spreads across your cheeks. This wasn't just about a vacation. This was about something much deeper, a pattern I'd been too naive to see until that moment. The late-night, urgent projects that somehow only fell to me. The presentations where my ideas became his talking points. The way he'd subtly redirect credit during client meetings. "Of course," I heard myself say, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "The client comes first." Marcus nodded approvingly, already moving on to the next agenda item as if he hadn't just shattered 3 months of careful planning. My sister's wedding in Barcelona, where I was supposed to be maid of honor. The art classes I'd booked in advance. The small apartment I'd rented near the Gothic Quarter, with a tiny balcony overlooking the orange trees. But it wasn't just the humiliation of having my personal time dismissed so publicly. It was the way Sarah avoided my eyes afterward, the way she'd known this was coming and said nothing. It was the realization that while I'd been playing by the rules, others had been playing an entirely different game. That afternoon, as I called my sister to explain why I wouldn't be walking beside her down the aisle, I felt something shift inside me. A quiet recognition that this pattern had been building for months, maybe years. The small compromises, the swallowed protests, the way I'd convinced myself that being the reliable one was a strength when it had actually become my weakness. As I hung up the phone, hearing the disappointment in her voice, I realized I had a choice. I could continue to let this define my career, my relationships, my entire sense of self-worth. Or I could choose to change everything. I didn't know how it would unfold, but one thing was clear. My life would never be the same again. Will I choose to stay silent, or will I take control of my own story? That night, alone in my apartment with the Barcelona guidebooks still scattered across my coffee table, the memories came flooding back. All those smaller moments I'd brushed aside, convinced myself were just part of working life. But now, in the quiet aftermath of Marcus's public dismissal, they felt like pieces of a puzzle I'd been too afraid to assemble. There was the team dinner 6 months ago, when Marcus had presented my market analysis as his own breakthrough insight. I'd sat there, fork frozen halfway to my mouth, watching him receive congratulations for work that had kept me up for 3 weeks straight. When I tried to interject, gently, professionally, he'd cut me off with a laugh. "Emma's always so detail-oriented," he'd said, as if my contribution was nothing more than fact-checking his brilliance. I remember how my stomach had clenched, how I'd excused myself to the bathroom just to breathe. Standing in that sterile restaurant restroom, I'd looked at myself in the mirror and practiced different ways to speak up. But by the time I returned to the table, the conversation had moved on, and the moment felt too distant to reclaim. Then there was the Kendall project, where I developed the entire client retention strategy. Marcus had scheduled the presentation for a day he knew I'd be visiting my father in the hospital. "Don't worry," he'd assured me. "I'll handle the presentation. You focus on family." It had sounded so considerate, so understanding. I'd been grateful. Until I learned he'd presented my strategy without mentioning my name once. The client had been so impressed that they'd requested Marcus personally for their next project. A project that came with a promotion opportunity I'd been working toward for 2 years. The pattern was clearer now, each memory sharp with fresh understanding. The way he'd redirect conversations when I spoke up in meetings. How my emails would somehow get overlooked when they contained ideas that challenged his approach. The subtle way he'd position himself between me and senior leadership during company events, creating an invisible barrier I hadn't even realized existed. But perhaps the deepest cut had been Sarah's silence through it all. Sarah, who'd started as my mentee, had been trained and supported through her first major client presentation. Sarah, who now sat in meetings where my work was being claimed by others and said nothing. Not even a glance in my direction, not even the smallest acknowledgement of what we both knew was happening. The betrayal wasn't just professional, it was personal. I trusted her with my strategies, my client insights, even my concerns about Marcus's management style. And she'd absorbed it all, filing it away for her own advancement while I remained exposed and unprotected. These weren't just workplace politics. They were systematic erasures of my worth, my contribution, my very presence in spaces I'd earned the right to occupy. Each incident had chipped away at my confidence so gradually that I'd barely noticed the erosion until now. Can I confront the hidden wounds, or will they remain buried forever? I woke up the next morning with something I hadn't felt in months. Clarity. Not the false clarity that comes from anger or hurt, but the deep, steady knowing that settles in your bones when you finally stop running from the truth. I made my coffee, really made it, grinding the beans and timing the pour, instead of grabbing whatever was fastest, and sat by my kitchen window watching the sunrise paint the city in soft gold. For the first time in years, I wasn't mentally rehearsing my day, anticipating Marcus's demands, or preparing responses to challenges that might never come. I was simply presented with my decision. The phone rang twice. Marcus, probably with some urgent task that would conveniently require me to stay late. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. I turned it off entirely. This wasn't about revenge, not yet anyway. This was about something much more fundamental, reclaiming my right to exist fully in spaces where I belonged. I'd spent so long trying to be the perfect employee, the reliable team player, the one who never made waves, that I'd forgotten I had the power to make choices. I opened my laptop and began documenting everything. Not just the recent incidents, but the entire pattern stretching back over 2 years. Every stolen idea, every redirected credit, every meeting where I'd been systematically excluded from conversations about my own work. I wrote down dates, witnesses, and email chains. The evidence was overwhelming once I laid it out chronologically. But documentation wasn't enough. I needed a strategy that went deeper than formal complaints or HR meetings. Marcus was skilled at corporate navigation. He'd survived 3 department restructures and 2 leadership changes. He knew how to position himself as indispensable while making others feel replaceable. I thought about the Morrison account, the one he'd used to justify canceling my vacation. The truth was, I knew that client better than anyone in the office. I'd been their primary contact for 18 months, had developed the retention strategies that had increased their revenue by 30%, and had personally managed the crisis when their original campaign had failed spectacularly. Marcus didn't know the client. He knew about the client, the difference between surface familiarity and deep understanding. And that difference was about to become very important. I started making a list of every client relationship I'd built, every process I developed, and every system that ran through my expertise. Not to hoard information, but to understand my true value. Somewhere along the way, I'd allowed myself to believe that being indispensable meant being invisible. But indispensable could also mean irreplaceable. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister. I understand about the wedding, but I miss you. Promise me you'll take care of yourself. Take care of yourself. Such simple words, but they hit me with unexpected force. When was the last time I'd truly taken care of myself? Not just managed my responsibilities or met others' expectations, but actively protected my own interests, my own growth, my own peace of mind? I made another decision that morning, one that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was going to stop protecting other people from the consequences of their choices. If Marcus wanted to take credit for my work, he could also take responsibility when that work was no longer available. If Sarah wanted to advance by staying silent about injustice, she could navigate her career without the benefit of my continued mentorship and insights. This wasn't about burning bridges. It was about stopping the practice of setting myself on fire to keep others warm. Can I find the courage to change my life, or will I hesitate when it matters most? The plan began to form over the following week, not in dramatic moments of inspiration, but in the quiet spaces between meetings, during my morning commute, in the gentle rhythm of strategic thinking I'd always been good at but had never applied to my own situation. Marcus had made a critical error in choosing the Morrison account as his justification. He'd picked the one client relationship where his ignorance would be most exposed, most costly. Morrison Industries wasn't just any account. They were 3 months away from renewing a contract worth over $1 million annually, and they'd specifically requested me for their upcoming product launch strategy. I began by creating what I privately called the knowledge map, a detailed inventory of every critical piece of information Marcus would need to successfully manage my clients without me. Client preferences, communication styles, internal politics, historical pain points, successful strategies. Information that existed nowhere but in my mind and my personal notes. Then I started adjusting my documentation practices. Instead of keeping comprehensive files that others could easily navigate, I began creating systems that appeared complete but were missing crucial context. A client brief that listed all the key players but didn't mention that the CFO and CMO had a long-standing feud that required careful navigation. Project timelines that showed deliverables, but not the informal check-ins that kept clients feeling valued and heard. It wasn't sabotage. Everything I was doing was technically correct and professional. But it was strategic incompleteness, and the distinction mattered to me. I wasn't trying to harm the company or the clients I genuinely cared about. I was simply stopped being the invisible safety net that made other people's carelessness look like competence. The Morrison launch was scheduled for 6 weeks out. I calculated that Marcus would need at least 2 weeks to realize he was in over his head, another week to admit he needed help, and by then it would be too late to prevent the client from noticing the gaps in understanding. The timeline was tight enough to create pressure, but not so tight that recovery would be impossible if he acted quickly and humbly. Meanwhile, I began reaching out to contacts at other firms, not to job hunt, exactly, but to refresh relationships I'd let grow stagnant while focusing all my energy on internal success. Coffee meetings with former colleagues, LinkedIn exchanges with industry contacts, casual conversations that reminded people I existed beyond the walls of this office. Sarah had been watching me differently lately, and I knew she sensed something had shifted. During our weekly check-in, she'd asked if I was feeling okay, if there was anything she could help with. Her concern felt genuine, which made it more painful. But concern after the fact, when it was safe to express, wasn't the same as solidarity when it was needed. "I'm fine," I told her, and watched something flicker across her face, relief or disappointment, I couldn't tell which. The most delicate part of my plan involved managing my own emotional state. I needed to remain professional, collaborative, and apparently unchanged. I couldn't afford to let anger or satisfaction show in my interactions with Marcus. He needed to believe that canceling my vacation had been just another successful exercise of authority, that I'd absorbed the blow and moved on as I always did. So I continued attending meetings, continued responding to his emails, and continued smiling politely when he made jokes at my expense. But internally, I was watching the chessboard, thinking several moves ahead, preparing for the moment when his assumptions about my availability and compliance would collide with reality. The strangest part was how calm I felt. For months, I'd been carrying this constant low-level anxiety, always anticipating the next crisis, the next demand, the next small humiliation. Now, with a plan in motion, that anxiety had transformed into something steadier, focused attention. I wasn't sure what I expected to feel when everything unfolded: satisfaction, vindication, regret. Maybe all of them at once. But for now, in the planning stage, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the quiet power of someone who knows exactly what they're doing and why. Will I feel victorious when it's over, or will the consequences leave me feeling empty? The moment of reckoning came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after Marcus had canceled my vacation. I was in my office reviewing quarterly reports when I heard his voice rising from the conference room down the hall. Not quite shouting, but that sharp, strange tone that meant someone was losing control. Where the hell is the Morrison brief? The real one, not this surface-level bullshit. I looked up from my computer and saw Sarah hovering outside his door, clutching a stack of papers, her face pale with that particular anxiety that comes from being blamed for someone else's mistakes. Through the glass walls, I could see Marcus pacing, phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing wildly. The Morrison Industries launch meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. It was now 11:30.
My phone rang.
Marcus, of course. Emma, I need you in the conference room.
Now.
I saved my document, straightened my shoulders, and walked down the hall with the measured pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. When I entered the conference room, the scene was exactly what I'd anticipated. Marcus red-faced and frantic, Sarah looking like she wanted to disappear, and scattered across the table, the carefully incomplete documentation I'd been maintaining for weeks. This Morrison file is a disaster, Marcus said, without preamble. None of this tells me what I actually need to know about the client. Where are the real strategy notes? I looked at the papers spread across the table, recognizing my own handwriting on documents that contained exactly what I'd put in them, accurate but incomplete information. Those are the files we've been using for the Morrison account. Is there something specific you're looking for? Something specific? His voice cracked slightly. Emma, I'm presenting to their entire executive team in 2.5 hours, and I just spent 20 minutes on a call with their CMO who made reference to 3 different strategy points that aren't mentioned anywhere in these files. I tilted my head slightly, as if trying to understand the problem. Which strategy points were those? He shuffled through the papers frantically. Something about their Q3 metrics being tied to retention rates and a previous campaign failure that's influencing their current approach, and he stopped, staring at me. You know all this, don't you? You've been managing this account for over a year. I've been supporting the account, yes, I said calmly. Though I understood you'd be taking the lead from here on out. The silence stretched between us, thick with realization. Sarah was looking back and forth between us like someone watching a car accident in slow motion. Emma, Marcus said, and for the first time in 2 years, I heard something in his voice I'd never heard before. Desperation. I need your help here. The Morrison contract is worth $1 million annually to this company. Of course, I said. I'm happy to help however I can. What would you like me to do? He stared at me, and I could see him processing the careful politeness of my response, the way I'd offered assistance without offering solutions. He stopped, ran his hands through his hair. I need you to present to Morrison.
Today.
You know the account better than anyone. That's very flattering, I replied, but I wouldn't want to overstep. You've made it clear that you're managing this relationship now. I'd hate to confuse the client by inserting myself into your process. The color drained from his face. Behind him, through the conference room windows, I could see other colleagues slowing their pace as they walked by, sensing drama, but not yet understanding its scope.
Emma.
His voice was quieter now, more careful. I made a mistake. I should have involved you more in the transition. But right now, we need to focus on not losing this client. I asked gently. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw the exact instant when he understood that his assumptions about my availability, my compliance, my willingness to clean up his messes had been fundamentally wrong. What do you want? He asked finally. It was the first time in 2 years that Marcus had asked me what I wanted instead of telling me what he needed. The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications that extended far beyond the Morrison account. I want to go to Barcelona, I said simply. I want the vacation you canceled to be restored. I want credit for the work I do going forward. And I want to be included in conversations about my own projects. He nodded slowly, the fight going out of him.
Done.
All of it. Can you present to Morrison? Of course, I said. I'll handle the Morrison meeting. As I gathered the files from the table, my files containing the real insights and strategies I'd carefully kept to myself, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and hollowness. I'd won, but the victory felt smaller than I'd imagined, more mechanical than triumphant. Will I feel relieved after this? Or will it leave me questioning everything? The Morrison presentation went flawlessly. I delivered the strategy I'd been developing for months, answered their questions with the deep understanding that comes from genuine relationship building, and watched their faces light up with the kind of enthusiasm that guaranteed contract renewal. By 4 p.m., we had their commitment for another 2 years, with a 20% increase in scope. Marcus shook hands with the Morrison team, accepted their congratulations, and made all the right sounds about collaborative success. But I saw how his smile never quite reached his eyes, how he deferred to me throughout the meeting in a way that felt more like surrender than respect. Afterward, as the Morrison executives filed out of our conference room, Marcus lingered behind. "Thank you," he said, and the words sounded strange coming from him, rusty, like a language he hadn't spoken in years. I nodded, gathering my materials, just doing my job. "Emma," he said as I reached the door, "about Barcelona. Take the time you need. The full 3 weeks you originally planned." I turned back to look at him. He was standing by the window, hands in his pockets, looking smaller somehow than he had that morning. "And the other things we discussed? Credit where it's due. Inclusion in decisions about your projects. All of it."
He paused.
I know I haven't been the manager you deserved. It was as close to an apology as I was likely to get, and a few weeks ago, it might have felt like enough. But standing there in the aftermath of my carefully orchestrated victory, I felt strangely hollow. The satisfaction I'd expected was muted, overlaid with something I hadn't anticipated, a kind of sadness for how far things had deteriorated before reaching this point. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine, staring at my laptop screen where I'd pulled up flights to Barcelona. I could book the trip now. I could call my sister and tell her I'd be there for her wedding after all. Everything I'd wanted was within reach. So why did I feel so empty? I thought about Marcus's face during the Morrison meeting, not his earlier panic, but the quiet resignation that had settled over him as he watched me handle the relationship he'd assumed he could simply take over. There had been something almost defeated about it, and despite everything he'd put me through, I'd felt a flicker of something that might have been pity. Was this what victory was supposed to feel like? This strange mix of satisfaction and regret, success and sadness?
I called my sister that night.
"I can come to Barcelona after all," I told her, and listened to her excitement, her relief, her joy at having her sister back for the most important day of her life. Her happiness was genuine and infectious, and for a moment, I felt the rightness of what I'd accomplished. But after we hung up, the questions returned. Had I really solved anything, or had I just proven I could play the same games as Marcus? I'd been strategic, yes, but I'd also been manipulative. I'd withheld information that could have prevented a crisis, even if that crisis had served my purposes perfectly. The strangest part was realizing that throughout this entire ordeal, I'd been focused on making Marcus see my worth, forcing him to acknowledge my value. But somewhere in the process, I'd lost sight of something more fundamental. I already knew my worth. I'd always known it. The real problem hadn't been Marcus's failure to recognize my contributions. It had been my willingness to accept his judgment as more important than my own. I'd spent 2 years trying to prove myself to someone whose opinion shouldn't have mattered more than my own self-respect. I'd won, but what exactly had I won? The right to stay in a job where I had to orchestrate elaborate schemes to be treated with basic professional respect? The satisfaction of watching someone else struggle with responsibilities they'd taken from me? A manager who would now defer to me out of necessity rather than genuine respect? Looking back at the confrontation, what struck me most wasn't Marcus's desperation or his eventual capitulation. It was the moment when he'd asked, "What do you want?" And I'd realized that for the first time in months, maybe years, someone was asking me that question, including myself. The revenge had worked exactly as planned, but it had also revealed something I wasn't sure I was ready to face, that maybe what I really wanted wasn't to fix this situation, but to stop needing it fixed at all. Has revenge really brought me peace, or is there more healing to be done? The realization came to me 3 days later, not in a moment of drama or revelation, but in the quiet simplicity of a Wednesday morning routine. I was making coffee when I suddenly understood what had been missing from my sense of victory. I'd been so focused on making Marcus see my value that I'd forgotten the most important audience, myself. For 2 years, I'd been operating under the assumption that my worth needed external validation to be real. But sitting there with my coffee, watching the morning light filter through my kitchen window, I realized that my worth had never been dependent on their recognition. I was valuable because of what I brought to my work, my relationships, my own life. Not because Marcus finally admitted it under pressure, but because I had always been those things even when they went unacknowledged. The revenge had been satisfying, yes, but it had also been a distraction from the real work, learning to value myself independent of others' opinions. The power I'd felt during the confrontation with Marcus wasn't real power. It was just the flip side of the same dynamic that had left me feeling powerless before. True empowerment, I was beginning to understand, meant stepping outside that system entirely. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I left the office at exactly 5 p.m. Not because I was making a point, but because my work was done, and I wanted to go home. It felt revolutionary. On my way out, I passed Sarah's desk. She looked up, and I saw the question in her eyes, the same one that had been there since my confrontation with Marcus. "Sarah," I said, stopping by her desk. "Do you have plans for lunch tomorrow?" She blinked, clearly not expecting the invitation. "No, I don't think so."
Good.
"Let's talk." It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, but it was recognition that our relationship deserved more than silence. That evening, I called my sister back. "I've been thinking about Barcelona," I said. "Not just the wedding, but the whole trip. The chance to remember who I am outside of this office." "And?" she asked, and I could hear the smile in her voice. And I realized something. I don't need permission to prioritize my own happiness. I just need to choose it. The next morning, I booked my flights to Barcelona. Not as a victory prize, but as a gift to myself, a recognition that my time and joy were valuable simply because they were mine. I also scheduled a meeting with our HR director to discuss my career development. Not to file a complaint about Marcus, but to talk about my goals and vision for my professional future. I wanted to explore opportunities that excited me, not just roles that felt safe. The strangest part was how different this felt from the strategic planning I'd done for my revenge. That had been about correcting a wrong. This was about building something positive, creating a future that felt aligned with who I was becoming. Marcus and I had found a new equilibrium at work, professional, respectful, but without the warmth that might have been possible if things had unfolded differently. That was okay. Not every relationship needed to be rescued. But more importantly, I'd found a new equilibrium with myself. I no longer needed Marcus to validate my worth or the company to recognize my value for me to know that I mattered. That knowledge was internal now, steady and unshakable. For the first time in years, I felt truly free, not because I'd won a battle, but because I'd stopped needing to fight it. Am I ready to move forward, or is there still something I need to let go of? The Gothic quarter of Barcelona was exactly as I'd imagined it. Narrow cobblestone streets that twisted like secrets, ancient stone walls warm from centuries of Mediterranean sun, and the scent of orange blossoms drifting down from hidden courtyards. I stood on the tiny balcony of my rented apartment, watching the morning light paint the city in gold and terracotta, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete peace with my choices. My sister's wedding was tomorrow, and I'd spent the week doing exactly what I'd planned, taking art classes in sun-drenched studios, wandering through markets, sitting in cafes with no agenda beyond watching the world move at its own unhurried pace. But more than that, I'd spent the week remembering who I was when I wasn't performing productivity or managing other people's expectations. The night before the wedding, my sister and I sat on a rooftop terrace, sharing wine and watching the city lights twinkle below. "You seem different," she said, studying my face in the candlelight. "Calmer. Like you're actually here instead of thinking about 17 other things." I smiled, realizing she was right. I am here. Really here. I think it's the first time in years that I've been fully present anywhere. "What changed?" she asked. I thought about how to answer that. How do you explain that you spent months orchestrating an elaborate scheme to expose your boss's incompetence, only to discover that the real problem was never his failure to see your worth, but your willingness to let his blindness diminish your own self-knowledge. I stopped waiting for permission to value myself. I said finally. The wedding itself was magical. My sister radiant in ivory silk, her partner's eyes bright with tears of joy. The ceremony held in a small chapel with light streaming through stained glass windows. As I walked beside her down the aisle, I felt the profound rightness of being exactly where I was supposed to be. During the reception, as we danced on a terrace overlooking the sea, I thought about the version of myself who had sat in that conference room 6 weeks ago, watching Marcus cancel my vacation with casual indifference. That woman had felt powerless, invisible, defined by others' treatment of her. But she had also been the woman who chose to change everything, who found the courage to stop accepting unacceptable treatment, who learned that true empowerment wasn't about winning battles, but about refusing to fight wars that diminished her spirit. On my last morning in Barcelona, I sat in the same cafe where I'd spent my first afternoon, journaling about the week. But instead of planning or strategizing, I found myself simply grateful. Grateful for the journey that had brought me here, for the sister dancing through her honeymoon, for the work that awaited me back home. Work I would approach as someone who knew her own value. I thought about Marcus, probably struggling through another client meeting, and felt nothing but indifference. I thought about Sarah, and felt something warmer, anticipation for the honest conversation we'd have when I returned. I thought about my career, my future, my choices ahead, and felt excitement rather than anxiety. The plane ride home was peaceful. I read a novel without checking my phone, dozed in the afternoon sunlight, and for the first time in memory, didn't spend the flight mentally preparing for the week ahead. I was ready for whatever came next, not because I had all the answers, but because I finally trusted myself to find them. As the plane began its descent, I looked out at the city spread below me and smiled. I was coming home, but more importantly, I was coming home as myself, fully, completely, unapologetically myself. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.